Fall down, get shot. Ask for water, get bayoneted. Walk or die. 3 simple rules. Clear, concise, easy to understand. The sort of straightforward instructions one might expect in a workplace safety manual, really. Except this wasn't a factory floor in Birmingham or a construction site in Toronto. This was April 1942, the Philippine peninsula of Bataan. And these weren't guidelines for avoiding industrial accidents. They were the terms of survival for 80,000 men, beginning what would become one of history's most notorious forced marches. 65 miles doesn't sound terribly far, does it? A decent weekend's walk through the countryside. Perhaps 2 days with proper preparation, comfortable shoes, the occasional cream tea stop. The sort of thing enthusiastic ramblers do for charity. But then, ramblers generally aren't starving, diseased, and guarded by soldiers with explicit permission to kill them for the slightest infraction. If you're finding this story as compelling as it is horrifying, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. These stories of courage and cruelty deserve to be remembered, and your subscription helps ensure they're not forgotten. To understand the Bataan Death March, we must first appreciate the spectacular cascade of miscalculations that led to it. Because nothing says military preparedness quite like assuming the enemy will politely follow your own strategic assumptions. December 1941. The American and Filipino forces in the Philippines were operating under a defense plan with the optimistic designation War Plan Orange 3. The plan essentially boiled down to hold the beaches, prevent Japanese landings, wait for the US Pacific Fleet to steam in and save the day. Brilliant, watertight, absolutely foolproof. There were just a few tiny problems. First, the US Pacific Fleet was currently resting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, having been rather dramatically introduced to Japanese naval aviation 10 hours earlier. Second, the Japanese had studied War Plan Orange 3 with the sort of attention to detail one typically reserves for restaurant menus when genuinely hungry. And third, this is the crucial bit, the Japanese had no intention whatsoever of cooperating with American expectations. How inconsiderate of them. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of US Army forces in the Far East, found himself in the awkward position of defending the Philippines with a force that was under-equipped, under-trained, and under the distinct impression that the war wouldn't actually start for at least another few months. His air force was destroyed on the ground despite having 9 hours warning after Pearl Harbor, a feat of unpreparedness so impressive it almost deserves its own documentary. The Japanese landings began on 22nd December 1941. By early January, MacArthur had abandoned War Plan Orange 3 in favor of the rather less optimistic War Plan Orange 3 has failed spectacularly. What now? This new strategy involved retreating to the Bataan Peninsula, a mountainous, jungle-covered thumb of land about 25 miles long, where the combined American-Filipino force would make a desperate last stand. The plan was to hold out for 6 months until reinforcements arrived. Spoiler alert, reinforcements were not coming. President Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs had already written off the Philippines as indefensible, but nobody thought to mention this to the 80,000 men digging foxholes in Bataan. Why spoil the mood? For 3 months, the defenders of Bataan held their ground against a numerically superior Japanese force. It was, by all accounts, a remarkable defensive action. Stubborn, determined, absolutely futile, but remarkable nonetheless. The problem, as it turned out, was logistics. MacArthur had planned for 43,000 men to hold Bataan for 6 months. He got 80,000 men instead, soldiers plus thousands of civilians who fled with the retreating forces. The food supplies calculated for 43,000 men for 6 months suddenly had to feed 80,000 men for, well, as long as possible, really. Mathematics has never been so cruel. Rations were cut in half in January, then cut in half again. By March, soldiers were receiving about 1,000 calories per day, roughly equivalent to a modest breakfast, if you're the sort who considers breakfast modest at 2 boiled eggs and soldiers. Except these soldiers were digging fortifications, fighting off Japanese attacks, and trying not to die of malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and beriberi. The troops nicknamed themselves the Battling Bastards of Bataan and composed a cheerful little ditty that went, "We're the Battling Bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn." Touching, really. Nothing quite captures the esprit de corps like poetry about being completely abandoned. By April, the situation had deteriorated from dire to catastrophically biblical. 3/4 of the force was sick. The hospitals were overflowing. Doctors were performing surgery without anesthetic because there wasn't any left. Quinine for malaria had run out weeks ago. Men were eating their horses, then their mules, then grass, then roots, then each other's leather equipment boiled into a sort of despair soup. Before we continue into what happens next, and trust me, it gets considerably darker, take a moment to like this video if you're appreciating the research that goes into these stories. The algorithm gods demand their tribute, and your like helps more people discover these crucial pieces of history. Right, onwards into the abyss. The Japanese called Bataan the Philippines graveyard. The Americans called it the Starvation Brigade. Both were correct. On 9th of April 1942, Major General Edward King Jr. left in command after MacArthur had been ordered to Australia in March. He famously declared, "I shall return," though perhaps "I'm leaving" would have been more immediately relevant to the chaps staying behind, surrendered the Bataan forces. It was the largest surrender in American military history. Approximately 76,000 men, 12,000 Americans and 64,000 Filipinos laid down their arms and became prisoners of war. Now, under the Geneva Convention, capturing forces are required to treat prisoners of war humanely, provide adequate food, water, medical care, basic dignities, the minimum standards of civilization. The Japanese had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention but never ratified it. A technicality, really. The sort of fine print that becomes rather significant when you're the one being taken prisoner, and the Japanese had some rather firm views about surrender. In their military culture, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death. To be captured alive was shameful beyond redemption. So when faced with 76,000 prisoners who had surrendered, men they viewed as having forfeited all honor and by extension, all right to humane treatment, well, let's just say the Imperial Japanese Army hadn't exactly prepared welcome baskets. The Japanese plan was straightforward enough. March the prisoners 65 miles north from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training facility that would serve as a POW camp. The march would take about 5 days, they estimated. There were several flaws in this plan. First, the Japanese had expected to capture about 25,000 prisoners. They got 76,000. So their logistical preparations, already minimal by Western standards, were now laughably inadequate. Second, these weren't fit, healthy men. These were walking skeletons riddled with disease, having subsisted on starvation rations for 3 months. Third, and this is where it gets truly special, many of the Japanese guards assigned to escort the march were survivors of recent battles. They'd lost friends. They were angry, and they'd been told these prisoners were dishonorable cowards who deserved no mercy. So what could possibly go wrong? The march began on 9th of April, 1942. It was the dry season in the Philippines. Temperatures hovered around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The roads were dirt, the dust was choking, and the sun beat down with the sort of aggressive intensity that makes one yearn for a nice British drizzle. The rules, as mentioned, were simple. Fall down, get shot. Ask for water, get bayoneted. Walk or die. Actually, that's not quite accurate. More precisely, fall down, get shot. Ask for water, get bayoneted. Walk, and probably die anyway. The Japanese provided no food for the first several days. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Men were not allowed to stop, help their comrades, or access the artesian wells that lined the route. If you tried to help a fallen friend, you both died. If you broke ranks to drink from a well, you were shot or bayoneted on the spot. The guards employed a motivational technique the prisoners came to know as the sun treatment. If you collapsed, you were dragged to the side of the road and left to die in the full sun. No shade, no water, just the Philippine heat and dehydration doing their work. Some guards would watch, timing how long it took. A bit of sport, really. For those who didn't die quickly enough, there was always bayonet practice. The Japanese also employed what might charitably be called improvised discipline. A soldier steps out of line, beheaded, someone too weak to continue, shot, a prisoner with a pair of Japanese-issued shoes, murdered for looting. The guards would sometimes order prisoners to bury men who were still alive, but too weak to protest. Efficiency, you see. At various points, the march would halt at rest areas, which sounds rather lovely until you learn that these were fenced enclosures with no shelter, no sanitation, and no water. Thousands of men crammed into spaces designed for hundreds. Men died standing up because there wasn't room to fall down. The Filipino civilians along the route tried to help, bless them. They'd throw food, toss canteens of water, offer bananas and rice cakes. The Japanese guards would beat them back. Sometimes they'd catch a prisoner receiving help and execute him on the spot as an example. Because nothing says maintaining order like murdering the starving for accepting food. Here's where we must pause for a moment at what might be called documentary discretion. Because what follows is a litany of such calculated cruelty that one almost runs out of ways to describe it. Almost. Prisoners were forced to march past the decaying corpses of their comrades, left to rot as warnings. Some guards would make the POWs count the bodies aloud, a bit of forced participation in the theatre of their own mortality. Men with dysentery, which is to say, nearly everyone, were not allowed to stop for biological necessities. They soiled themselves and kept walking. The smell must have been extraordinary. The dignity demolished. Guards would randomly select prisoners for questioning, which inevitably meant beatings, torture, or execution. The lucky ones were merely beaten unconscious. The unlucky ones were buried alive, crucified on trees, or used for bayonet practice while still conscious. Some guards played games. They'd offer water from their canteens, then pour it on the ground while the prisoner watched. They'd throw food into latrines and force prisoners to retrieve it. They'd make men dig their own graves, then shoot them as they stood in the holes. At night, those who survived the day's march were herded into already overcrowded enclosures. Men slept standing up, if they slept at all. Disease spread like gossip. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, dengue, all getting quite friendly with each other and their hosts. Medical personnel were sometimes forced to leave their patients behind. Doctors watched their wounded patients bayoneted because they couldn't keep up. Medics who tried to help were beaten or killed. One American doctor who pleaded for mercy for a dying patient was beheaded beside him. The Japanese officers, it must be noted, varied in their conduct. Some were genuine sadists who participated enthusiastically in the cruelty. Others were simply indifferent, letting their enlisted men do as they pleased. A very small number, tried to maintain some semblance of discipline and humanity. But here's the thing about atrocities. It only takes a few enthusiastic participants and a lot of indifferent bystanders to create absolute hell. The bureaucracy of cruelty, if you will. I know this is difficult material. These stories matter precisely because they're uncomfortable. If you think others should hear this history, and I rather think they should, please share this video. These men deserve to be remembered, and sharing helps ensure they won't be forgotten. Now, let's talk about what came next. After several days of marching, survivors were loaded onto railway cars for part of the journey. This sounds like a relief, doesn't it? Off one's feet, a chance to rest. Perhaps a moment of respite. Right. The railway cars were small steel freight wagons designed for cargo, not humans. The Japanese packed them with the efficiency of London rush hour. If London rush hour involved shoving 100 people into a space meant for 40, then sealing the doors and leaving them in 100-degree heat. No ventilation, no sanitation, no water, no room to sit or lie down. Men stood pressed together in complete darkness, breathing each other's exhaled air, standing in their own waste. Some died standing up. Their bodies remained upright, held in place by the press of living flesh around them. The journey lasted hours. When the doors finally opened, the living would literally pour out, many too weak to stand. The dead would remain inside until someone bothered to remove them. Then it was back to marching. By the time the survivors reached Camp O'Donnell on approximately 17th-18th April, estimates suggest somewhere between 500 and 1,500 Americans had died during the march. The Filipino death toll was far worse, perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 men. These are estimates because, well, the Japanese weren't particularly fastidious in record-keeping when it came to dead prisoners they'd just murdered. Camp O'Donnell itself was essentially a death camp, though unintentionally. It had been designed for about 10,000 Philippine Army trainees. It now held over 50,000 prisoners. There was one water spigot for the entire camp. Sanitation was non-existent. Shelter was inadequate. Disease ran rampant. In the first month at Camp O'Donnell, 1,500 Americans died. Around 26,000 Filipinos died in the first 2 months. But at least the marching had stopped. When news of the Bataan Death March eventually reached the outside world, it became one of the defining atrocities of the Pacific War. The systematic cruelty, the casual murders, the deliberate infliction of suffering. It was barbarism on an industrial scale. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Lieutenant General Homer Masaharu, who commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines, was tried for war crimes. His defense was essentially, "I didn't know it was happening. I was busy with operational matters." And really, if you think about it, military command is rather complicated. The tribunal was unimpressed. Homer was found guilty and executed by firing squad in April 1946. Several other officers were also tried and convicted. Many of the guards who participated in the atrocities were never identified or prosecuted. Some lived long lives, perhaps occasionally thinking about that hot April in 1942 when they murdered unarmed, starving men for trying to drink water. The survivors, meanwhile, carried on. Those who lived to see liberation, and many didn't, dying in Japanese camps, forced labor details, or hell ships during transport to Japan, returned home changed. Some spoke of their experiences, many didn't. How do you explain horror to people eating Sunday roast in peacetime comfort? The Bataan Death March stands as a particular type of atrocity, not the explosive violence of a massacre, not the bureaucratic evil of an extermination camp, but the sustained, casual cruelty of men who had decided their prisoners were unworthy of basic humanity. It was murder made banal through repetition, killing as routine, suffering as policy. I'm curious, and I ask this genuinely. Had you heard of the Bataan Death March before this video? Leave a comment below. I find it fascinating which historical events remain in public consciousness, and which ones fade despite their significance. Your comments also help me understand what stories you want to hear next. Here's the truly absurd part. The Japanese gained almost nothing from this barbarism. They could have treated the prisoners humanely. They could have provided basic food and water. They could have transported them in vehicles, given them medical care, followed the basic rules of warfare. The march would have been difficult regardless. There was a war on after all, but it needn't have been a death march. Fall down, get shot, ask for water, get bayoneted, walk or die. Simple rules for a simple situation. The survivors remembered those rules for the rest of their lives. They remembered the sun, the dust, the screams, the bodies. They remembered what humans are capable of doing to other humans when all constraints of civilization are removed. And we remember them. We remember the Bataan Death March not just as historical fact, but as warning that cruelty doesn't require elaborate machinery or complex ideology. Sometimes it just requires indifference, orders, and the heat of an April day in the Philippines. The distance was only 65 miles. A weekend's walk, really. But for 10,000 men, it was 65 miles too far. If this video has affected you, and frankly, it should have, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. We cover forgotten stories, uncomfortable truths, and the moments in history that shaped our world, often in ways we'd rather not acknowledge. There are more stories like this one, stories that deserve telling. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss them. For my existing subscribers, thank you. Your support makes these deep dives possible. For everyone else, welcome aboard. Let's make sure these stories aren't forgotten. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the dates and battles. It's about the 80,000 individuals who walked that road, the 10,000 who didn't make it, and the question we should always ask ourselves, what would we have done?